All over the Western Hemisphere, in Chile and Panama, in Ecuador and Argentina, a new power is making its presence felt. Until recently, China had little interest in Latin America. Now, its investment is transforming the region. Great Decisions investigates this new phenomenon, as well as the challenges it has brought: rising levels of debt, worries about creeping authoritarianism, and the prospect of direct competition with the United States. Competing for influence, China in Latin America. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
In June 2017, the Panamanian government made a bombshell announcement. Panama would become just the second nation in Central America to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China.
Today, Panama breaks its diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
A world that is connected, that is globalized, where cooperation amongst countries is necessary to achieve development and to really advance. It's necessary to be connected to such a large country.
It was a decision that caught the U.S. State Department unawares.
It came as quite a surprise to the United States. I was the serving ambassador at the time, the president, Juan Carlos Varela. He had been publicly supportive of switching recognition. We were surprised more at the timing and, frankly, at the fact that there wasn't any pre-consultation. I was not made aware of it until literally about an hour before the president went on television and announced it.
Of course, I did not inform John right when we were about to sign. He's right about that, and it's our sovereign right to do so. And we decided to do it that way on purpose because we knew that it would be very hard to have it done otherwise. I think a country like mine can be mature and understand the challenges and the advantages to my country on dealing with different countries.
This is about a step forward in a more assertive foreign policy for the Dominican Republic.
Over the next 14 months, two other countries, the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, followed Panama's lead.
We are convinced that this is the correct path that will lead to the development of mutually beneficial links for our two peoples.
In the recent period, China has been putting a lot more pressure on countries that are diplomatically aligned with Taiwan to switch, and they have a lot of leverage to bring to bear on different governments.
Interestingly enough, some of these countries would have done this earlier, but it was China that told them to hold off. But once there was an election in Taiwan and the pro-independence party won, well, all bets were off.
China's bid for recognition in Latin America reflects a new priority for a country whose main focus, under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative, has long been in Asia and Africa.
We've seen China expand the Belt and Road Initiative to the Latin American region. It's been something that's focused more extensively on Asia and Europe and Northern Africa to a degree, but has become increasingly global over the years.
In several of the Chinese government's statements, Latin America is included as a part of the Belt and Road. We have seen a lot of activities Beijing is doing in Latin America.
Now, with President Trump determined to check China's growth, Latin America has turned into an unexpected battlefield.
Make no mistake about it, China's doing it for its own interests. They want the markets that they create to play according to the Chinese rule, which is a government-run system, not an open market economy. They also are using these avenues for their national security purposes, including stealing intellectual property and jeopardizing our national security.
I think China's involvement in Latin America is an economic threat. I'm from Florida. Our biggest trading partners are generally South and Central America. This is a clear competitor to the United States in our backyard. There's no question they're not our friend.
China's interest in Latin America ramped up in the early 2000s, when the so-called pink tide brought leftist governments to power throughout the region.
Traditionally, the Chinese have focused more on countries like Venezuela and Ecuador, and these are countries that in China are regarded as leftist. So there was a natural political linkage there.
There was a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China, a man by the name of Li Changchun, who first traveled to Venezuela, struck a friendship with Hugo Chavez, thought it was a good idea for China to make inroads in Venezuela. He found an ideological sympathy with Hugo Chavez, so they started going in with all these loans for Venezuelan infrastructure.
The Chinese have been extremely sophisticated in cultivating Ecuadorians. Years ago, when I was the U.S. ambassador there, they sent a Chinese ambassador who was a charming, talented woman, spoke impeccable Spanish. Immediately set about getting to know Ecuadorians, organized and funded trips for the president of Ecuador and cabinet to go to China.
Gradually, China's attention has expanded to the entire region. Beijing now bankrolls massive infrastructure projects in dozens of Latin American countries, especially in the transportation and energy sectors.
The big story with the Belt and Road Initiative has been infrastructure building, which obviously takes a lot of capital, which a lot of the governments in Latin America are short on. And traditional, commercially oriented financing structures aren't so interested in because they see it as risky.
Countries like Panama that offer diplomatic recognition to Beijing can expect a windfall of Chinese investment.
Shortly after Panama reestablished diplomatic ties with Beijing, President Xi visited. And that was a very productive meeting. There were nearly 18 agreements that were signed on a whole range of issues, including infrastructure and connectivity.
A Chinese company won the tender for building the fourth bridge of the Panama Canal. That's a $1.4 billion project. Panama is being built up by China into its main logistics and transport hub in the Americas.
There were no deals on the table for Panama's establishment of relations with China. And I think this is very important to be highlighted because other countries have done it differently. Other countries have established relations with China in exchange for large infrastructure projects or investments.
Often, Beijing has been willing to provide funding for large-scale projects that Western creditors have declined to support.
One of the most emblematic projects of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Latin American region is the Belgrano Cartas rail expansion in Argentina. This is a project that the Argentines have wanted to do for a very, very long time. It requires billions in finance, and very few have been interested in supporting this project financially. China has.
This is a very important railway that crosses the agricultural heartland of Argentina. And it is as much in China's interest as it is in Argentina's interest to modernize this railway. This railway transports materials that are essential for China: soy, wheat, corn, flour.
Chinese loans require the use of Chinese companies and of Chinese equipment. Argentina happens to produce a lot of the things that would be required to build a railway. But the loan conditions were such that they required the importation of Chinese equipment fully across the board, which was detrimental, I think, to local industry.
Not all of China's investments in Latin America have paid off. American politicians are quick to highlight examples of shoddy or unnecessary construction.
You saw this quite clearly here in the region at the Coca-Cola-Sinclair Dam in the jungles of Ecuador. The dam now runs to half capacity. The steel used to make it is full of cracks. There are accidents. Nearly every top official that was involved in the dam's construction is either imprisoned or sentenced on bribery charges.
When the projects are not good projects, they're stranded capital, then they want the country to pay them back, and the country said, wait, this thing doesn't work, I don't need it.
But Latin American observers, particularly those from the region's strongest economies, say that doing business with China is simply a necessity.
China has become the major partner, trade partner with Brazil. China has also become important as a source of capital flows. They are new investors in areas such as high-tech, fintech, and banks.
Our countries are going through a very difficult moment. Growth this year will be absolutely minimal. Now, the way to deal with that is to associate yourself with the parts of the world that are growing at high rate.
One problem for Latin American countries that rely on Chinese capital is the risk of racking up debts they cannot possibly repay.
That's appealing if you are the leader of a nation that is poor, that needs money, and the Chinese come in and say, we'll give you a soft loan. You're focused on today. You're not focused on what's going to happen 10 years out when those loans come due.
Members of the Trump administration have repeatedly accused China of pursuing debt trap diplomacy, with the goal of gaining political influence.
Let me say with great respect to all the nations across this wider region and the world, do not accept foreign debt that could compromise your sovereignty. Protect your interests. Preserve your independence.
Debt trap is a tricky term because by using the word trap, it suggests intention. It suggests that this is a premeditated scheme that China had sought out before it reached out to recipient countries. And that is a narrative that I personally do not agree with.
That leads me to the question that is often posed, whether China practices so-called debt diplomacy. Some people say that China purposefully lends money to countries to get them into debt and then take over their assets. It wouldn't be a very wise diplomatic strategy.
When countries struggle to pay back their debts in cash, China collects it in other forms.
Part of the lending to Venezuela, for instance, it comes with a collateral. If Venezuela is not capable of paying back, China has a right to be paid in oil.
Ecuador has huge debts to China in terms of the oil it must pay them. 80 to 90% of all of their production is due to China over the next 5 to 10 years.
Even in oil-rich countries, however, China's investments can be risky.
Chinese oil investment in Venezuela now is regarded as not only a debt trap for Venezuela, but also a trap for China as a lender, because Venezuela domestic politics turned south, and the government is unable to repay the loans that it took from China.
China continues to offer financing to Venezuela, but in lesser amounts than we've seen in previous years. So everything is about sort of maintaining the status quo, a degree of stability, and trying to ensure that enough oil is being produced to be able to pay things back.
So at some point, these countries will come to the conclusion that, as they say, if you owe the bank $100, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $1 billion, the bank has a problem. So in this case, maybe China has a problem.
As Beijing invests more and more heavily in Latin America, it is inevitably drawn into political controversies in the Western Hemisphere, including ones that China's leaders would prefer to avoid.
China has always maintained this policy of non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign nations, but as China's footprint grows globally, whether in Latin America or other regions, inevitably China will be dragged into some political issues.
China wanted to host a meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank in China. But there's a delicate issue, which is that most IDB members recognize Juan Guaidó as a legitimate president of Venezuela. So the IDB countries say, well, if you want to host us, fine, we'll come. Just make sure you invite the person we consider to be the legitimate president. At the end of the day, China ended up canceling the meeting. So that's what happens with China in Latin America. They usually stumble unnecessarily into these situations.
One major project that has done little to enhance China's reputation is a secretive satellite tracking station in Argentina, which has left many locals confused and frustrated.
In 2014, China and Argentina signed an agreement permitting China to build a space station in the Neuquén region in Patagonia in Argentina. The space station is staffed nearly exclusively by Chinese nationals.
I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of the Chinese is here.
The Chinese haven't done anything here. They haven't left behind anything of value.
China has consistently maintained that this space station is purely for peaceful purposes. However, the space station is managed by an agency that has very close ties to the People's Liberation Army, China's military, which has raised concerns in the US and elsewhere about whether the space station has a dual use.
If there is so much security, they are protecting or want to investigate something. No, an observatory does not need that many guards just to see the moon.
Officials within the Trump administration have responded to China's growing presence in Latin America by citing the Monroe Doctrine, a declaration from 1823 that warned European countries not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere.
A few years back, during the Obama administration, John Kerry, then Secretary of State, gave a speech in which he sought partnership-based relations with Latin America, genuine partnerships.
The relationship that we seek and that we have worked hard to foster is not about a United States declaration about how and when it will intervene in the affairs of other American states. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over.
It was a good line in a speech. It got some applause. And then, I think mostly for rhetorical purposes, obviously, and the Trump administration, National Security Advisor Bolton brought it back.
Today, we proudly proclaim for all to hear, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.
The Monroe Doctrine started as a way of saying we are rejecting foreign interference in our hemisphere. It came to be interpreted in the hemisphere as the U.S. will tell the governments of this region what to do.
The Monroe Doctrine has always been very offensive to Latin American countries. We have never quite agreed and been happy with the Monroe Doctrine. It's not something that Latin American countries look up to.
I don't know that we could enforce it maybe the way President Monroe could back then, but as a matter of principle and hemispheric solidarity, I think that the fact that now that we have more Latin American countries agreeing with the United States about China is kind of a non-militaristic reflection of the Monroe Doctrine's principles.
In April 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to Santiago, Chile. where he laid out the Trump administration's case for why Latin American countries should reject Chinese influence and investment.
The basic message the Secretary of State Pompeo conveyed during his visit was that trading with and doing business with China was a dangerous proposition.
China does business in places like Latin America. It often injects corrosive capital into the economic bloodstream, giving life to corruption and eroding good governance.
To say that Chile should not trade with China is a bit of a complicated proposition. If Chile were to stop trading with China, the economy would fall apart.
Ultimately, our strategy as a nation can't be to try to keep China out of economic markets around the world. It has to be to compete with Chinese products and Chinese investment. The United States has no complementary vehicle by which to offer economic investments in South America side by side with the offers that they're getting from the Chinese.
This administration has been pulling back on U.S. participation. As a result, there's a void. And China has been very willing to come in and try to fill that void. So we've seen China presence in our hemisphere rise as the U.S. presence has declined.
Latin American observers have also noted the disparity between the American and Chinese approaches to their region.
When U.S. cabinet members visit Latin America these days, all they do is talk about China. When Chinese cabinet members visit Latin America, all they do is talk about trade and investment. And, well, there's an interesting contrast there. And I suppose you can guess which one is more effective.
When they go around saying, beware the Chinese, it's from a very paternalistic point of view, as if we needed to be told, as if we didn't understand what the risks were, as if it was the United States who had to come and inform us of the risk of engaging the Chinese. And I would tell you, no, most of these countries understand the risks. They're only appealing to China because the United States has shunned them.
The Chinese have occupied a void. They fill the blanks. The whole Latin America, and there is no exception, is in dire need of infrastructure investments. So why would they simply listen to a plea, to a call from Washington to stop the entry of Chinese capital without having any alternative to fill the blank?
In an effort to help the U.S. compete with China around the world, Congress passed legislation called the BUILD Act in October 2018. That law paved the way for the Trump administration to establish a government agency that directs private sector funds for international development.
In 2019, the Development Finance Corporation was created to extend U.S. foreign policy and development goals by operating in more than 90 countries around the world to bring affordable housing and water and infrastructure to the partners that need it most.
Well, I think the BUILD Act is a good opportunity to pull private sector investment and public sector investment together, more along the lines of the way MITI in Japan and some of the other national investment support programs do.
You can draw a contrast between our investments throughout the region and China's investment throughout the region. We believe that the private sector is able to catalyze stable societies better than state-directed authoritarian government investment.
In the end, there is little consensus about China's engagement in Latin America, even from those in the region who have watched China's relationships develop up close.
The Chinese are like corporate raiders. They come in, they make a sweetheart deal with management, start cost-cutting, firing workers. The people of the countries that China goes into usually end up fearing the Chinese. The Chinese antagonize the people of the countries where they go into.
Not only have we not had any significant antagonisms or difference with Chinese companies, our problem is that we don't have enough of them. We would like to have more Chinese companies in Chile. We would like to have more Chinese investment.
Whether the future brings conflict or cooperation between China and the United States, one thing is clear. American policymakers must now grapple with the consequences of China's rise in every corner of the world, including in their own backyard.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.